There's a folder on my laptop I named the tab. I created it 3 years before I ever opened it in front of anyone. 3 years of adding to it, quietly, the way you collect evidence when you already know the verdict but can't say it out loud yet. I'll get to the folder. First, you need to understand what it was like to grow up being the one who paid for everything and got credit for nothing. My parents had 2 daughters, me and my younger sister Daphne. On paper, we were raised in the same house, by the same people, eating the same dinners. In practice, we were raised in 2 completely different households that happened to share a zip code. I was the responsible one. That was the word they used, responsible. They meant it as a compliment. It took me until I was 26 to understand it was just a polite way of saying useful. Daphne was the creative one, the sensitive one. The one who needed extra patience, extra support, extra everything. She cried easily, which my mother interpreted as depth of feeling. She quit things easily, which my father interpreted as being too good for whatever she'd tried. She borrowed money and never paid it back, which both of them interpreted as her just needing a little more time to find her footing. I found my footing early. That was my first mistake. I got a part-time job at 16, saved money, graduated high school with a 3.9 GPA, got a partial scholarship, took out loans for the rest, and started college without asking my parents for a single cent because I already knew that money, once given to me, would be silently resented. Money given to Daphne was an investment. Money given to me was a drain. By 24, I was working full-time as a paralegal at a mid-size firm in Cincinnati. I had my own apartment, my own car, a used but reliable Honda CR-V I'd bought outright, and a savings account I was genuinely proud of. I was not rich. I was not even comfortable in the way people mean when they say comfortable. But I was stable, and stable was something no one in my family had ever really taught me how to be. I figured it out on my own, the way I figured out most things. Daphne, at 22, was living at home. She'd tried community college for a semester, a cosmetology program, a wellness coaching certification she found on Instagram, and a brief dramatic relocation to Nashville with a boyfriend who lasted 4 months. Each time she came back, my parents welcomed her like she'd survived something harrowing. Each time I visited, they asked me if I was seeing anyone and whether I thought my job had real growth potential. I drove home 1 Sunday a month, every month, because my mother had decided that Sunday dinners were important, and I was the only one who showed up consistently. Daphne showed up when she felt like it or when she needed something, which were usually the same occasion. It was at one of those dinners, in late October, that my mother told me the plan. They were going to co-sign on an apartment for Daphne. Not just co-sign. They were going to cover the security deposit, the first and last month's rent, and set up an automatic transfer from their account to cover half her monthly rent until she got on her feet. The apartment was in a neighborhood I couldn't have afforded when I was her age. It had in-unit laundry. I had a coin-operated laundry room in the basement of my building. I had climbed 4 flights of stairs carrying a laundry basket every week for 2 years without mentioning it once. I said, "That's really generous of you guys." My mother said, "Well, she needs a foundation, Nora." You know how she is. Nora, that's me. I drove home that night with the radio off. I want to be clear that I did not immediately become bitter. Bitterness is not something that arrives all at once. It accumulates, it settles in the corners of things you tell yourself are fine, and one day you reach into a corner and find it's been full for years. The corner filled a little more in February when my father called to tell me they'd had a small financial emergency. Furnace went out, and could I possibly help cover it? I said yes, because of course I did. I transferred $1,400 the same afternoon. My father said he'd pay me back when things settled down. Things did not settle down in any way that resulted in $1,400 coming back to me. In March, my mother mentioned, almost in passing, that they'd had to dip into savings more than expected because Daphne had some unexpected expenses with the new apartment. Furniture. A few household things. My mother said it with the specific tone she reserved for things she expected me to silently absorb. I absorbed it. In April, Daphne texted me directly for the first time in 6 weeks. The text was one sentence: "Can I borrow $300? I'll get it back to you by Friday." I sent her $300. Friday came and went. 3 Fridays came and went. I added it to the folder. The folder had started as something I didn't entirely have a name for. I'm a paralegal. I work with documents every day. I understand the weight of a paper trail. Somewhere around the third or fourth time money left my hands and didn't return, I started keeping records. Not to do anything with them, just because it felt better than keeping it all only in my head, where it mixed with everything else and made me feel crazy. I had a spreadsheet. Dates, amounts, what was said, what was promised, what happened. I had screenshots of texts. I had one recorded phone call. Legal in Ohio, which is a one-party consent state, something I know because I work in a law office. From a conversation where my father told me he'd take care of the February money and I should stop worrying about it. I wasn't planning to use any of it. I was just documenting the way I document everything, because it's the only way I know how to make sense of the world. The folder sat on my desktop behind a photo of a hiking trail from a trip I took alone 2 summers ago. I looked at it sometimes. Then I'd close my laptop and go to sleep. Everything changed the weekend of my mother's birthday. She wanted a family dinner. Real restaurant, not home cooking. She picked a place in Hyde Park that had a prix-fixe menu and cloth napkins, the kind of restaurant where the bill for 4 people comfortably clears $300 without anyone ordering anything unreasonable. I want to be accurate about this part. My mother called me the week before and said she thought it would be nice if we went in together on her birthday dinner. I said sure. She said she was thinking Daphne and I could split it. I said sure again because I'm apparently incapable of saying anything else in real time. I should have asked what split it meant. I didn't. The night of the dinner, Daphne showed up 20 minutes late wearing new boots I recognized from a brand I knew wasn't cheap. She hugged my mother for a long time and whispered something that made my mother laugh. She sat down and immediately started talking about a ceramics class she was taking and how she thought she might have a real talent for it. The dinner was lovely. My mother was happy. I ordered the salmon and a single glass of Riesling and told myself that tonight was not the night to feel anything complicated. The check came. My father reached for it, looked at it, and then set it down in the middle of the table in a way that wasn't quite putting it down and wasn't quite offering it. Daphne looked at her phone. I watched this happen. I watched my sister look at her phone while a $340 check sat between us, and then I watched my mother look at me with an expression I have spent my entire life learning to read. It was the expression that meant, "You'll handle this, won't you? You always handle things." I put my card down. Daphne looked up from her phone and said, "Oh, are we splitting it?" My mother said, "Nora's got it." That was it. That was the whole conversation. Nora's got it. Like I was a vending machine that had been loaded and was simply waiting to be pressed. I did not say anything. I signed the receipt. I drove home. I opened the folder. I added the dinner. $340 plus tip, plus the $9 parking. I looked at the running total at the bottom of the spreadsheet for a long time. $6,847. That was the number. $6,847 over 3 years, and amounts that ranged from a $40 emergency grocery run my mother had asked me to cover one afternoon to the $1,400 furnace payment. Loans never repaid. Meals absorbed. Expenses quietly handed in my direction because I was the responsible one, and that word, I had finally understood, was not a compliment. It was a job description. I closed the folder. And then I did something I had never done before. I made a decision I didn't explain to anyone. I opened a new checking account at a different bank. Not my primary bank, not the one my parents knew about from years of emergency money transfers. I started direct depositing a portion of each paycheck into it. Not a dramatic amount, enough over time to matter. I also, quietly, removed my parents from the emergency contact field on my health insurance and replaced it with my closest friend. I updated the beneficiary on my 401k. Small things. Administrative things. The kind of tasks that feel like nothing but mean everything. I was not planning revenge. I want to be honest about that. I was planning exit. What happened instead was that Daphne came to me in December. She didn't call. She drove to my apartment, which she'd never done, and knocked on my door at 9:30 on a Tuesday night. When I opened it, she looked terrible, not sick, but frantic. The specific kind of frantic that comes from having spent the last several days avoiding a problem until it arrived at full size. She'd lost her job. The apartment co-signed by my parents had a lease renewal coming up, and the landlord had raised the rent by $400 a month. My parents, she explained in a voice that kept threatening to break, had told her they couldn't absorb the increase. They'd suggested she find a roommate, which she didn't want. They'd suggested she look for a higher-paying job, which she found unhelpful. Then she'd suggested something to them, and they had apparently agreed. They think you could add your name to the lease, she said, as a co-signer, just temporarily until I get back on my feet. I looked at her standing in my doorway. The new boots from the birthday dinner. The ceramics class, back on her feet, as though her feet had ever been on the ground in a way she'd managed herself. Who suggested that? I said. You or Mom? She didn't answer, which was its own answer. I said, come in. She sat on my couch. I made tea because I needed something to do with my hands. We talked for an hour, and what I heard underneath everything she said was the architecture of a plan that had been designed without consulting me and assumed my participation as a given. My parents would continue covering half the rent. Daphne would find something, some kind of work. My name would be on the lease as a backstop, meaning, if Daphne didn't pay, I was legally responsible. They had not asked whether I had the financial standing to do this. They had not asked whether it would affect my own rental history, my credit, my capacity to eventually rent or buy something for myself. Those questions had not occurred to them because my financial stability had always been treated as a communal resource rather than something I'd built for my own future. I sat across from my sister and I looked at her and I felt something shift. Not into anger. Into clarity. I need to think about it, I said. She looked relieved, which told me she'd expected me to say yes immediately and was interpreting, I need to think about it, as a yes on a slight delay. Of course, she said. Take a few days. The renewal is due in 3 weeks. She left. I opened the folder. I looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. I thought about $6,847. I thought about the birthday dinner check, and the furnace, and the $300 that never came back on any Friday. I thought about the word responsible and all the years I'd let it mean something different than what it actually was. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney. I should explain. The firm I work for handles civil matters, and through 3 years of working there, I had developed the kind of professional relationships that come from showing up on time, doing good work, and remembering people's coffee orders. One of the attorneys, a woman named Patricia, had told me once, half-jokingly, that if I ever had a personal legal question, I could always ask her. I asked her. I told her the full picture, the loans, the dinner, the cosign request, the folder. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You've been doing this in Ohio, so let me tell you a few things." She told me what co-signing a lease would actually mean for my credit profile and my debt-to-income ratio. She told me what documentation I'd need if I ever decided to formally pursue repayment of the loans. She told me, carefully and without drama, that informal loans between family members are notoriously difficult to recover in court, but that written records and documented requests for repayment can sometimes establish enough of the pattern to matter. The most important thing, she said, is that you decide what you actually want before you do anything. Not what they want, what you want. I thanked her. I sat with it for a week. What I wanted was simple. I wanted my money back. Not all of it. I was realistic. I wanted an acknowledgement that it existed, and I wanted to not spend the next decade as the structural support for a family that had never once asked if the structure was holding up fine. I decided to say no. The no was not the hard part. The no was once I'd made it, almost peaceful. What I did before the no was the part I had to plan carefully. I typed out a document, not a legal document, just a clear, detailed accounting of every amount in the folder. dates, amounts, what had been said. Attached the relevant screenshots. Kept the tone factual, the way I write memos at work, the way I was trained to write things that need to be taken seriously. I titled it A Summary of Shared Financial History. I printed 3 copies. I called my mother and told her I wanted to come home for dinner that weekend to talk about the lease situation. She sounded pleased. She said she'd make pot roast. I drove home on a Saturday in January. The pot roast was good. We ate and talked about nothing difficult, and after the dishes were cleared, my father poured coffee and my mother sat down with the particular settled posture of a woman who believes the conclusion is already reached and the meeting is just a formality. I put 3 copies of the document on the table. I said, "Before we talk about the lease, I want to talk about this." The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence I had never heard in that house before. Not the silence of a commercial break or the silence of everyone thinking. It was the silence of something landing. My mother picked up the document. I watched her read the first page. Her expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but something around her eyes did. A small tightening that I recognized as the beginning of recalibration. My father said, "What is this?" I said, "It's a record of money I've transferred to this family over the last 3 years. The total is $6,847. Some of it was framed as loans. None of it has been repaid. I'm not presenting this as an accusation. I'm presenting it as context for the conversation we're about to have." My mother set down the document. She said, "Nora, this is family. We don't keep score in family." I said, "I understand that's how you think of it." From where I was sitting, it felt less like family and more like a recurring expense. My father started to say something about tone. I let him finish. Then I said, "I'm not going to co-sign the lease. I've consulted with someone I trust on what that would mean for my financial situation, and it's not something I can do responsibly." I had chosen the word deliberately. Responsibly. I watched my mother register it. "What I'm willing to do," I said, "is put this document away and not discuss it again if we can have an honest conversation going forward about what I can and can't help with. I'm not closing the door. I'm asking for it to go both ways." Daphne, who had been sitting very still since the papers hit the table, said, "I can't believe you've been tracking all of this." I looked at her. "Someone had to," I said. It did not go smoothly after that. My mother cried, which she does when the conversation stops going the way she expected. My father got quiet in a way that was worse than yelling. Daphne left the table and came back twice. But here is what happened, because I want you to know it happened. My father, at the end of the night, said, "I didn't realize it had added up like that." It was not an apology. It was not a check. But it was the first time in my memory that a number I had been holding had been acknowledged as real. My mother called me 4 days later. She did not apologize exactly, but she said she thought they'd been leaning on me in ways they hadn't paid enough attention to, and she wanted to be more fair going forward. It was a careful sentence, the kind that protects the speaker while still reaching towards something. I said, "I appreciate you saying that." Daphne found a roommate. The lease renewed without my name on it. We did not talk for 2 months, and then she texted me a photo of something she'd made in her ceramics class, a small, uneven bowl that was genuinely kind of beautiful, and said, "Thought you might like this." I looked at it for a while. Then I wrote back, "I do. The folder is still in my laptop. I haven't added anything to it in 7 months. I don't know if that means it's over or if it just means nothing has happened yet. But I know what the folder is now, what it was always for. Not evidence, not ammunition, not a case to be won. It was proof for myself that the things that happened to me were real. That I hadn't imagined the weight of them. That carrying something quietly does not mean it isn't there. I am still the responsible one in my family. I suspect I always will be. But responsible, I've decided, is going to mean something different now. It's going to mean responsible to myself first, the way they put on airplanes, secure your own mask before assisting others. I had been in that cabin for 26 years, handing out masks while mine sat in the overhead compartment. I put mine on. That's the whole story. Except I do want to tell you one last thing, because it happened and it mattered. 3 weeks after the dinner, I got a card in the mail, my mother's handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a birthday card, not even close to my birthday, and tucked inside the card was a check for $500. In the memo line it said, toward the tab, it was not $6,847, it was not accompanied by anything that explained itself. It was just a check and a phrase that told me the document had been read more carefully than anyone let on. I deposited it. I updated the spreadsheet. $6,347 remaining. Running total, column B, cell 22. I closed the laptop. I went outside and it was cold and bright, and I stood on my front steps for a while doing nothing, which is something I have gotten much better at. It was enough, for now. It was enough. I've thought a lot about why I waited so long. Not why I kept the folder. That part I understand. I kept it because I needed something to be real outside of my own head. When you're the person everyone leans on, there's this quiet pressure to be grateful for being needed, to reframe the wait as a privilege. The folder was the one place I didn't have to do that. It was just numbers and dates and what actually happened, stripped of the story I was supposed to tell myself about it. What I've thought about more is why it took 3 years and a cosign request to finally say out loud what I had known for a long time. I think it comes down to this. I confused endurance with virtue. I told myself that handling things quietly, absorbing the expenses, never asking to be paid back, that this was what a good person did for family. That patience and generosity were the same thing. They're not. Patience is choosing to wait. What I was doing was choosing to disappear, a little at a time, and calling it love. The spreadsheet didn't make me hard, it made me honest. There's a difference, and it took me a while to see it. Tracking what happened to me wasn't bitterness, it was the opposite of bitterness actually, because bitterness lives in your chest and eats at you quietly. And what I was doing was getting it out of my chest and onto a page where I could look at it clearly, where I could ask myself, is this really okay? And once I asked that question with the numbers in front of me, I couldn't pretend the answer was yes anymore. Daphne didn't become a bad person because my parents handed her everything. She just never had the chance to find out what she was capable of on her own. That's its own kind of deprivation, even if it doesn't look like one from the outside. I'm not angry at her anymore. I'm something more like sad for her. And I try to hold that separately from what happened to me. My mother's check for $500 wasn't the point. The memo line was the point, toward the tab, because it meant she had read the document carefully enough to absorb its title, and she had chosen, in her own quiet way, to acknowledge it. My mother is not someone who apologizes directly. That check was as close as she knew how to get. I decided to accept it as what it was, not hold out for the version I might have preferred. What I know now is that clarity is not cruelty. Saying no is not abandonment. Keeping a record of what is owed to you is not smallness. It's self-respect, and self-respect is not something you owe anyone an apology for. I still drive home once a month. The pot roast is still good. Things are different in ways that are hard to explain but easy to feel. There's a little more care in how questions get asked, a little more space for my answers to matter. I put my mask on. Finally. That's not a small thing.